It's Friday, December 6th. Welcome to This Week in Impact, where we bring you some of the most interesting impact investing and sustainable finance stories of the week. I'm Brian Walsh, and I'm joined by ImpactAlpha's editor, David Bank. Today we'll discuss the ownership economy, two different models for increasing employee wealth, plus lessons learned from how one development finance institution, those quasi-public investors tasked with accelerating global development, has attempted to engage in higher risk, higher impact catalytic investing. And finally, the untapped potential for investment and innovation within America's care economy. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Hi, David. How are you doing this week?
I'm doing great, Brian. We had a tsunami warning out here this week, just when you thought things couldn't get any worse.
Well, the tsunami of news continues unabated this year, even as we count down to the final days of the year. But first, let's talk about the ownership economy. David, we've been talking more and more in recent months about the ownership economy, which has become a regular focus for ImpactAlpha. We had two stories on the beat this week, reflecting two approaches to the effort of sharing more wealth with employees. The first approach comes from larger, more established private equity firms who have managed to share a little of the wealth with the employees in their portfolio companies. The other approach comes from more impact-focused fund managers who are actively raising capital to focus on converting businesses into employee-owned enterprises. They intend to share more of the wealth with employees, but are struggling to raise money. So, David, what should we make of these two strategies?
Yeah, Brian, it's interesting. We're no longer just talking about sort of whether to share the wealth, so to speak, with workers, but sort of how much of that wealth to share. So these are two strategies at different ends of the market. And at the top end, there's these big private equity companies led by KKR that have adopted what they're calling shared ownership strategies and cutting workers in for a stake of the winnings when these private equity companies exit. And that tends to be around 5% or less. It can still be a pretty big windfall for those workers on the order of a couple $100,000, enough to, put a down payment down on a house or send a kid to college. So it's not nothing, but it's about 5% of the value of the company. At the other end are much smaller and more bespoke funds, often with quite innovative strategies or targets for low-income workers or Black and brown workers or frontline workers in one case, essential workers. And they are trying to provide at least 30% and in some cases up to 100% ownership of the company to workers. And no surprise, those smaller and more bespoke strategies have not been raising as much money as obviously these big private equity companies are. So you've got kind of two different approaches to the same, I think, quite appealing proposition, which is, let the workers who are building the wealth of those companies share in some of the appreciation.
Now, with the first approach, it is definitely an improvement on the traditional private equity approach, which is in some ways often to cut the workers altogether and lay them off as part of restructuring of these companies that they acquire. So it certainly is an improvement on that. But as you say, that the actual payoff is pales in comparison to the huge returns that the private equity fund managers themselves receive from the work they put into these restructuring and management deals.
Yeah.
So how do private equity firms determine the proportion of the equity allocated to employees versus executives?
Well, again, it's a sort of, glass half full, half empty thing, or you could say like we're at the first step of quite a long journey because, as you say, private equity is kind of unwinding a different kind of legacy that they've had or a reputation that they've had over time. The new report from the association of these private equity firms that are kind of promoting this strategy, it's called Ownership Works, and they put out a report that so far their members have distributed $570 million to some number of thousands of workers, and that's a down payment, as it were. They claim by 2030 something like $20 billion of wealth from these companies will have been distributed or at least accrued to those workers. And they have a pipeline of some kind of 113 deals, I think, that in which workers have been cut in. The 570 comes just from the first 6 or so that have had exits. So there's kind of a long pipeline and a pretty decent prospect that there will be some significant wealth transferred. But as I said, I think that the sort of rule of thumb is that it turns out to be about a stake of 5%. And again, that doesn't really cut into private equity investors' own share, because arguably the worker-owned companies or the companies where workers have a stake, are at least worth 5% more, and so the workers sort of earn it back for themselves in a way, and the private equity investors, don't take a cut. And the question is, are there investors who are willing to actually share the wealth and cut in workers at a much higher rate?
Right. So this is the difference between things like employee stock ownership plans or worker cooperatives or employee ownership trusts that we've been covering in Impact Alpha, which is the kind of more innovative approach, or the approach for these more impact focused fund managers are trying to take, versus private equity, who's trying to say let's share a little bit of the pie with our workers.
Yeah.
Whereas the others is saying let's kind of convert the pie to an employee owned pie altogether.
Yeah, you could put it that way. You mentioned ESOPs. There are, as you say, a variety of different forms that worker ownership can take, and these employee stock ownership plans are kind of the granddaddy of them, and have quite significant tax benefits for the companies that convert. And again, Pete Stavros at KKR has expanded his kind of portfolio of activities to expanding ESOPs, and there's a new group sort of advocating for that. And private equity firms are moving in to help finance ESOP conversions, which are kind of a deeper variation of employee ownership. So the conversation is advancing, and as I said, now the question is not just whether to share some of the proceeds with workers, but how much, and that's a good conversation to be having.
Speaking of a good conversation to have, we have our next Agents of Impact call coming up on Thursday, December 12th, that hints at some of these themes. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, we talked before about the documentary that we produced at Impact Alpha called Equity and Ownership, Napoleon Wallace and the Reconstruction of Black Wealth. And we had a very successful premiere in October at SoCap, and we're now going to show it. It's just a 20-minute documentary, but we're going to watch it together at the Agents of Impact call next week. And we'll have Napoleon Wallace, who folks know is living with a late-stage ALS diagnosis, and meanwhile building this network of organizations in North Carolina around these notions of sort of equitable wealth building. And so we're very excited to be showing that video, and hope folks will join us.
All right. Well, you can RSVP for that event. There'll be a link in our show notes, along with links to the 2 articles we talked about on this topic on ImpactAlpha.com. But for now, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll look at whether one development finance institution is actually trying to use finance to catalyze further development. Development finance institutions are those quasi-public investment funds generally backed by rich country governments, with a dual mandate to have a meaningful impact in the regions where they are investing, alongside financial sustainability. DFIs, as they're called, often get criticized for focusing more on the financial side and less on the impact side. But the UK government's DFI, rebranded as British International Investments, or BII, to overcome its outdated roots when it was initially known as the Colonial Development Corporation, has spent the past 10 years focusing on driving more impact. Our colleague Jessica Pothering wrote for us this week about lessons learned from the past 10 years of catalytic investing by the British International Investments. So, David, what do we learn from this?
Yeah, well, BII, British International Investments, has been one of the few that has staked out this catalytic end of the investment spectrum, and that tends to be the higher impact and arguably possibly lower return or higher risk side. And so, as you say, there's sort of lessons here, because the DFIs, the development finance institutions across the world, are being pressured to play more of such a catalytic role, and not just to be sort of quasi-commercial investors themselves, but to actually crowd in other commercial investors by being able to take a riskier position, or an earlier position, or a first loss position in a deal. And so what BII found that they've got about $1.9 billion in the so-called catalytic investments through what they call their catalyst funds. And they found that they broke even essentially, and that met their capital preservation goals. And they've been able to then get additional capital to deploy. So they're calling this a success, and they have some examples which we can get into about how that kind of early money or higher risk money really does make a bigger difference. So they're finding that they can fulfill that development mandate that you said, preserve their capital, and it's a small portion of the overall portfolio, but it helps create a pipeline. Some of these investments that started on the sort of more impact side have graduated up to the more, I guess, commercial part of their portfolio, and they're calling the 10 years, a success.
So how does BII assess the effectiveness of its catalytic investments then, beyond just the preservation of capital?
Well, they look at obviously the impact. I mean, there's a example they use, Med Access. I think it's their biggest check, something like $200 million that they put in back in 2017, and it was a sort of advanced purchase guarantee facility for life-saving drugs and health products in Africa. So things like malaria bed nets and HIV tests and treatments for tuberculosis. And if you could guarantee a market in these African countries, then drug companies and others would be procuring for them and distributing there. And then once that sort of market mechanism gets established, prices come down, and sort of the free market, so to speak, itself can take care of it. And they've can look at all kinds of products that have now are now sort of more available and accessible in those areas, and it's now operating on its own break-even model, and so it can go forward. That guarantee mechanism can now go forward on its own. So there you've sort of set something in motion, and then you've got sort of perennial or long-term returns. Another one they point to is called Load Share, and it's based in Bangalore in India, and it helps last mile logistics companies essentially finance their fleets, their 2- and 3-wheeled EVs to do e-commerce and other kinds of deliveries. And again, you get that kind of lending going, and you get you prove out to banks and others that you can make decent loans in these things. In fact, the operating cost of these EVs is much lower. So really, the riskiness is almost taken care of, up front, because the maintenance costs and the fuel costs and whatnot is much lower. But in any event, you get that whole market going. There's fuel saving. You attract drivers from lower income backgrounds. So there's sort of livelihood benefits. There's obviously climate benefits. There's just access to services and goods benefits. And it's also a good lending product.
All right, now, so this is all coming out of their catalyst fund, but let's talk about the meta catalyst of this. And do we have any evidence that there's an influence of this BII model, let's call it, on other DFIs, other development financial institutions? Are they being influenced or affected by this approach and trying to change their own models to be oriented towards more catalytic investments and less financial returns?
Again, that's a very hot topic, and I would say, you'd get a different take from different folks in the marketplace, but certainly much more so than they were a few years ago. Or put it this way, they're talking about it much more so than they were a few years ago. And so we've seen a lot of efforts on the part of folks like the Dutch DFI FMO, and I think the Danish DFI, and even the U.S. DFI, which is called the U.S. International Development Finance Corp, are doing deals that have a much higher risk profile than they used to be comfortable with. So I don't know exactly whether the numbers are out for the DFI sector globally, but they are at least moving to step up to this role that they're being pressed for. The political types are saying, we need you to go make these kinds of deals happen, that they're not just going to come to you as fully kind of packaged commercial deals. You need to go help put them together. And we've talked about some of these kinds of blended finance deals where the DFI can now provide some of the loan loss guarantee or first loss guarantee, and bring in commercial investors. So the activity is up, all across blended finance. The DFIs are much more engaged, and I think the full impact of that has yet to be seen, but signs are hopeful.
But in any event, the vibes have shifted, you would say.
The vibes have shifted, and maybe the intent has shifted, if not yet the capital deployments as writ large.
Okay, well, you can read Jessica's full piece on impactalpha.com. We'll have a link in the show notes. For now, let's take one more quick break. When we come back, the significant potential for investment and innovation within the U.S. care economy. We had a guest post this week from the authors of a recently published guide to investing in the care economy, which has the potential to boom thanks to an aging U.S. population and increased need for child and elder care. So, David, how should impact investors think about the care economy?
Yeah, this is one that kind of hits home for a lot of people I know, including my family, where there's older folks that need some care, and there might be new babies that need some care too. So both ends of the life spectrum, and a lot of people have been talking about, including in the recent presidential campaign, about this care economy and the need to kind of both elevate the quality and elevate the working conditions, and elevate the care that folks get. I mean, this is family members that we all love. And so we want to make sure that the kind of mechanisms that are being put in place at the beginning of life, at the end of life, and to help families cope with all that. So this was it's a huge market and a growing market, something like $650 billion already. And it's ripe for impact investing. Again, there's, as in many things, you could invest in a high impact way, and you could invest in an extractive way as well. There's, private equity has, of course, moved into sort of nursing homes, and in many cases, cut staff and cut quality of care. And so, you could call that a care economy investment, but it's not necessarily a positive impact one. So this is a sort of, how do you think about making a positive impact, and where are the kinds of financial products that you can put your money into?
Building on our earlier topic of the ownership economy, connecting it to the care economy, and really the focus here is on workforce development. So what strategies can be implemented to ensure that investments in the care economy lead to the creation of quality jobs that support the caregiving workforce?
Well, I mean, that's, one of the things that people have to keep an eye out for, and obviously, seek to measure and monitor. But again, it goes often to, who are the managers that are making these investments. So, mission-driven finance, we've been tracking them for quite a long time. They have a care access real estate REIT, real estate investment trust, and they help childcare operators buy the buildings and the property where they're operating. So that sort of both gives them an asset, fosters the stability of that school or that childcare center, and also as a wealth appreciation opportunity for the operators. There's lots of sort of platforms and that are connecting folks. There's one called Honor that folks may have heard about that connects caregivers with older adults. There's one called Papa, which pairs older adults with Papa Pals for companionship and assistance. One of the strategies that the authors recommend is invest in women-led funds and companies. The men might object, but the notion is that there's a kind of lived experience there that I think is inarguable that women might have. Another is to reflect on your own care journey, they say, and if it's a need for you and your neighbors and your friends, you could probably extrapolate that it's a need for many others, and so you'll start to see where things can be improved.
And that focusing on women-led fund managers who are investing in the care economy might be important just from their lived experience, but also the fact that back to the workforce considerations here, it's the care economy workforce is predominantly female and minority. And so, how to ensure that those quality jobs promote the economic inclusion and equity that impact investors care so much about.
Well, and there's an additional gender lens to it, which is that there's this, wealth transfer that, is ongoing. growing, and much of it is going to women, both as descendants and then also as sort of widows. And so women are having a much larger share of the sort of assets under management that the great asset management firms are managing. And so they have a outsized influence now in sort of directing investments into things like the care economy that also have disproportionate benefits for women, as you say, both as recipients of the care and also workers.
All right. Well, you can read much more about the care economy and why you should care about it. We'll have a link to it in our show notes. But for now, David, that's going to do it for This Week in Impact. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, Brian, as always.
And thank you all for listening. This Week in Impact is a production of ImpactAlpha and part of the ImpactAlpha podcast network. Smart conversations by and for impact investing professionals. For more exclusive stories about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join thousands of other agents of impact by subscribing. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. If you like the show, please subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen, and be sure to leave us a 5-star rating. It really helps other people discover the show. Thanks, as always, to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For David Bank, I'm Brian Walsh. We'll see you next week for more Impact.